Hello. Perfect. Good. The audio works, which is a good start. Good evening, and welcome to this, our second speakers event of Michaelmas term. My name's Charles Connor. I'm the Speakers Officer at the Union for Michaelmas. And luckily for you all, I'm not doing the interview today. Tom Sutcliffe, the acclaimed BBC 4, Radio 4 journalist, is going to be doing that instead. A few points for me to start off. First of all, I'd really like to thank WPP, our sponsors for the evening, who should have some information for you at the benches or available for you as you leave in the foyer. Secondly, it's really, really great to be working with Heifer's events. So I know some of you in the audience have come here via Heifer's. Some of you are members of the university who are coming here as union members. Hopefully this should be the start of a really productive long-term working relationship between the union and Heifer's to bring in some top quality authors every term to this really wonderful setting. And thirdly, for union members in particular, or prospective union members, our open period ends tomorrow. So we've got two more events, one which is the debate tonight, immediately after this, and the second which is Chelsea Handler, the Netflix chat show host. Before we end, and try to remember this because we do have a bit of a changeover, we're going to empty the gallery first, and then empty the lower chamber. There will be a book signing in the dining room afterwards, and you'll be directed towards that if you're interested by our stewards. So look out for the stewards. You haven't, however, come to hear me just list lots of practicalities, so I'm going to introduce for you our two speakers for tonight. Thomas Sutcliffe is a British journalist, as I mentioned earlier, and arts broadcaster who read English at Emmanuel. He will be interviewing Simon Schama. Mr. Schama, as well as being a hero of my Year 7 history classes, is the university professor of history and art history at Columbia in New York. He graduated in history from Christ in 1966 with a starred first. He'll be speaking on his new book, The Story of the Jews. So without further ado, Tom and Simon.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. Publication is no light matter in the Jewish tradition, and that goes back to the very beginning. Exodus tells us that when Moses came down from Mount Sinai, he had 2 tablets of stone. And in fact, there's actually a Talmudic tradition which gives us the measure. The measure is Hebrew, but it roughly translates as 20 inches by 20 inches by 10 inches deep. Huge. So, comparatively, Simon Schama has come in with relatively modest publication.
It's a pamphlet, isn't it? Yeah.
Except for one fact. He's bringing 3 tablets of stone down from the mountain. This, his epic history, The Story of the Jews, was originally going to be 2 volumes. It's now going to be at least 3 volumes. I say at least because it's got out of hand once. Who knows what will happen?
3.
We're here to talk about Volume 2, which is Belonging, the story of the Jews.
It was actually meant to be 1 volume. I mean, talk about stupid hubris, actually. And
well, that's why I say at least.
Yeah, that would have been impossible. No, my publisher, my American publisher, says this is Volume 2 of ... 9, ? But don't be frightened, there will only be 3.
How determined were you before that it was going to be 1?
It lasted into about the second week of research, probably, actually, and then I knew it was really impossible.
Well, anyway, this is the book we're here to discuss, the second volume of this great history, which takes us from 1492 to 1900. And I can't make the Moses analogy go any further, because the Decalogue is prescriptive and terse, and it's rather light on social detail. I think some of those coveting commandments have a hint of a soap opera about them, but it's a bit stark. Whereas this book is capacious, rich with historical detail, full of nuance, full of a really humane sympathy for human fears and human failings. It's no surprise to me that it's been shortlisted for the Baillie Gifford Prize for all of those qualities, but I think they're probably also attracted to it by the ways in which this history resonates with our present and our current fears. I don't need to introduce Simon Schama because he's already been introduced, but also any historian who's the subject of Dead Ringers impersonations and gets Harry Enfield doing pastiches does not need an introduction. So I'm going to start straight in on the book. And I want to start on the cover, Simon, with that title, which has puzzled quite a lot of reviewers already, I think. It looks rather innocuous. After reading 700 pages in which communities find out violently, sometimes lethally, that they're not regarded as belonging, why was it that you settled on that word as the...
Well, I mean, you're absolutely right that it seems now, well, not seems, it clearly does have resonance with our contemporary predicament, in which I think, slightly to the surprise of us who are trained in this very university, to think that very large social structures, class, crises of capitalism and so on, ideologies defined as in the time of the Cold War were the fulcrums on which history turned. Discover, after all, that a kind of tribal atavism is commanding center stage, and particularly that one of the three massive problems of our time, the other being the slow death of the planet and horrific inequalities between developed and undeveloped countries, that right there in the middle of what determines so much sensibility and so much political outcomes these days, from Arizona to Myanmar, are the plight of the displaced. What we used to in our pretentious Anal days called transhumance, but vast wash of migrants. Been huge, great tidal waves of migrants since recorded history, and particularly 20th century after the First World War and again after the Second World War. But somehow, the notion that actually the great waves of people who are exactly as you say, Tom, who are disabused of the notion that they can live two lives at once, by which I mean they can retain the distinctiveness of their community, whether it's a religious community or a language community, and yet claim to be deeply at home in the place in which they settle, turns out to be, just an extraordinarily important and very often tragic issue. I think actually, I was first aware of this in a non-Jewish way when I was actually making a set of programs called The American Future of History in the year of what turned out to be Barack Obama's election. And we went to Dearborn, Michigan, deliberately, and sat with the mostly Syrian, some Lebanese community in Dearborn, who'd come after the war. Some of them had gone into the automobile factories. Some of them had been dry goods merchants and grocers and so on. And they told in a very non-fiery but very poignant way the story of how they'd been many generations in America and were as about American as, apple pie as you could imagine, of having been sort of suddenly regarded with suspicion by their neighbors whom they'd known for a long time. And I thought, yes, something really weird was happening then already, which now has become paramount, and which I think of as the politics of estrangement, of suddenly deciding that someone with whom you're familiar, be it the Bangladeshi newsagent or the agricultural worker in Arizona and his family who you've known, suddenly can be manipulated into seeming to be alien and not of the home. And I thought, well, and this happened, this wasn't why I wrote the book, volume 2, and everything, the grand and not so grand stories in that were why. But it did seem to me that Jewish experience was the kind of forerunner and outlier of that problem. How do you live two kinds of lives at once? What choices do you make? And it begins, as you know, the first good 100 pages or so of the book are a group of Jews, the Marranos, who've taken the ultimate choice of becoming converts to Christianity, and some of them doing it very seriously, but many of them having a secret Jewish identity. I mean, they marry in churches and cathedrals in Lisbon and in Antwerp and go to Mass, but they have this secret, remembered life as Jews. And that, of course, is not good enough for the Inquisition. The Inquisition comes to concentrate on what the Emperor Charles V calls falsos Christianos, false Christians. So they are the prime target for the Inquisition. So their issue is, where can they belong? Where do they go to? Do they belong to a properly Jewish community who also can regard them with suspicion? Or do they belong in a permanent kind of maritime no man's land, really? So that's
one of the tantalizing tragedies of the book, I think, is that there are these fugitive moments, and it is the fact that they are fugitive. You don't use the word belonging in the actual text very often, but you do say of the Polish Jews, in a peculiar way they belonged. You're writing about Jews in Poland in the 17th and 18th century, when they have a very successful society with some freedoms, and then it ends badly.
Yeah.
Again.
I mean, I want to say, and I hope we'll come back to that actually it's quite interesting to me that in an entirely sympathetic and open-minded way, a lot of the reviews, which have been astonishingly generous, have also taken the ultimate thrust of the book, because it ends with Herzl, ends with Germany, and the beginnings of political anti-Semitism in Vienna and Berlin as inevitably darkly tragic. But there are three huge cases: the Dutch, the case of the United States in the 19th century, and pretty much the case of Britain, where the story, and the case of Jews in China, which is an extraordinary story, where the story is much brighter. But it is the case, to go back to your point, that one of the things on the antennae of moving, displaced communities that they have to consider is actually what the host country might want of them. And even in that ferocious, I call it snapping jaws of the Inquisition in Portugal, out of which the fugitives desperately try and escape, the Inquisition doesn't arrive till 1536. The Portuguese king and the emperor, whose entrepot is in Antwerp, and depend on this extraordinary kind of far-flung commercial network of the Jews to bring money in the shape of spices, and East Indian spices, back to Europe. So there is a sense in which simultaneously what's happening are empires of religion or states of religion in the 16th century, but also the glimmerings of national consciousness in England or Germany. But at the same time, there's a wonderful Russian historian who I give a huge shout out at the end, if some of you don't know, called Yuri Schlesnik, who's written a book called The Jewish Century, which is really about the 20th century. But he calls the Jews, I think, some of you may hate it, but I rather like it, in a felicitous term, Mercurians, as in Mercury, gods of trade, but also winged sandals as well. And all these kind of core states and societies need the far-flung. They actually, and as Europe becomes imperial as well in non-European parts of the world, they need it even more. That had been the case in the Middle Ages, where Jews spoke 5 or 6 or 7 languages and had relatives in Cairo and in Tripoli and on the Coromandel coast of India. But by the same token, you are, as Theresa May would say, citizens of nowhere. You run the risk of suddenly being accused, actually, of being too mercurial.
Well, it's the very thing that has made you
exactly
indispensable.
Useful.
Is also the thing that makes you
That's
suspect.
Right. That's right.
You said just then that the book begins with the Marano Jews. It also, of course, begins with a single sentence, as all books must do. And I want to talk to you a little bit about how you write history. I'm going to read 2 chapter openings because I think they're wonderful. And the first is, in fact, the very opening of the book. Sometime, somewhere, between Africa and Hindustan lay a river so Jewish it observed the Sabbath. Now, I would defy anybody not to read the next sentence after that. And the other one is this: so much could go wrong if you wanted to shoot someone in Amsterdam in 1640, even if you were of sound mind, which Uriel de Silva was not.
Da Costa.
Uriel de Costa was not.
Yeah.
But neither of those sentences are anxious about the formal dress of academic history, it seems to me.
Yeah.
They are entirely interested in telling a story, and you call the book The Story of the Jews, not The History of the Jews.
Yes. I suppose it's a sort of slightly arch self-consciousness in doing that, but it's sort of inherited from, again, something you very kindly mentioned in the first book. I was very conscious that Judaism in roughly the 8th century BC was one of the two cultures, the other one being archaic Homeric Greece, Homeric Greece, properly speaking, in which it sort of invent storytelling in a way that's not fantastical Mesopotamian, saga, that there are identifiable human characters really doing sorts of extraordinary things. So I was very conscious in that first volume of the relationship between the voices I was hearing and how stories then got built and transmitted in greater or lesser poetic form, above all in the Bible. And there's a big passage in Volume 1 about how Josephus really has to be himself, not only a kind of traitor to the Jewish cause and adopted by the Emperor Vespasian, who gives him his apartment in Rome, but he has to be in Rome with this shifty identity, really, not quite belonging to either of those cultures, before he then can construct this beautiful, multicolored, astonishingly thrilling kind of narrative that he does. Now, in this period witnesses not only the printing press, but the emergence out of the chrysalis of Judaic strictures, the possibility of creating alternative Bibles, alternative accounts of wandering, many of them fantastical. Very quickly, apart from, and the reason why we have a fantastic geography, absolutely on page 1, is because actually that geography was supposed to account for the whereabouts of the lost tribes of Israel. And if you knew where the lost tribes of Israel beyond this river, which stopped flowing every 7th day, if you knew where they were and had some sort of notion of their re-emergence, then you started to hear the distant trumpets heralding the arrival of the Messiah. And that was a common interest, rather astonishingly, that Christian Hebraists, Christians who were learned in Hebrew literature and in the Kabbalah, had with Jews. There's one extraordinary case of a cardinal of Viterbo during the time of Pope Clement VII in the early 16th century, housing a famous Kabbalist, Elijah Bahur, in his own palazzo and library. And I wanted to get the sense, above all, of the widening audiences to which these writers and voices could play. Many of them, wherever there was an autobiography, I jumped on it, and not necessarily the autobiography of a great and learned man. I mean, one of the stars of the book, I like to think, is this extraordinary boxer, Daniel Mendoza, who is the first sportsman, I think, to write his sustained memoir. He's certainly the first famous British sportsman, and he sort of tantalizingly does so, not by running away from the fact that he's Jewish, but turning it into a massive commercial promotion, in effect. So he has a very particular East End Sephardi voice, and so on. So I'm listening to them.
There is a catch-22. I mean, it is a book full of catch-22s, that the one that we've just referred to, that what makes you indispensable also makes you suspect. But also in terms of story, it seems to me that stories were vitally important to create a sense of community for isolated Jewish communities, but they also bear down on them in difficult ways. Millenarian Christian notions bear down on them very heavily. And in fact, they're a sort of odd reflection of Jewish messianic traditions too. And they're caught somewhere between scriptures very often.
Yeah, that's quite true, because actually in all these moments of friendship, and closeness, which are many, there's another wonderful one, at least for me it's wonderful, I hope for you too, between a very kind of radically free-thinking Christian in Holland called Adam Borrell, who really doesn't believe, as the most radical Calvinists did, doesn't believe in any churches, believed that any institutional churches were a violation of what Christ intended, as a kind of, sort of presumptuous sacrilege. against God and the Savior. And he strikes up an extraordinary, amazing friendship with a man called Jacob Judah Leon, who is known as Templo, because Templo has built a model of Solomon, a big, big model of Solomon's temple in his house in Amsterdam, which is one of the obligatory tourist stops for kings and queens and princesses, as well as visiting merchants. And the two of them are so close that they actually publish a guide to how to vocalize, speak out loud, the Mishnah. The Mishnah is the first anthology, lexicology of Jewish observance that was written and redacted pretty much in the 1st and 2nd century AD. In other words, the vowels and how you might chant it out. But, exactly to your point, Tom, Templo, within this lovely moment of unforced amity, is still aware that Jews are not the other great reason, apart from their commercial utility and their far-flung networking, why they're kept around is because the whole teleology of Christianity and the return of the Savior depends on their conversion. And this indeed is very delicate tightrope act, actually. And very shocking and startling are those Jews who decide, the hell, enough of this, I can't stand this, painful kind of acrobatics. And so Theodor Herzl, of all people, before he actually writes Judenstaat, he actually proposes, and he's one of many, a mass public conversion of all Jews in front of the cathedrals in Vienna. It's absolutely extraordinary.
That was one of the more astonishing facts in the book, which is full of astonishing facts. You also describe those who gathered to listen to Herzl at the First Zionist Congress in Basel as a literary and scriptural bunch of Jews. I thought that was a very interesting balance, because it seemed to capture both those who have a program of assimilation, literature, and scripture, which is entirely about a religious notion of identity.
Yes.
And those two are at odds, aren't they?
They turn out to be at odds. There is, again, a golden moment which goes wrong. That's the Moses Mendelssohn moment in Germany at the end of the 18th century, where Mendelssohn, who is brought up in an absolutely incredibly beautiful but very narrowly Orthodox background, decides that Hochdeutsch, really, not Yiddish, not Judeo-German, but proper Hochdeutsch, if only Jews could actually master that. And so you can see the gates to what became the Jewish German community at the professions in medicine and science and law especially, opening, as he says it. If only they could master that, then scripture and literature, literally, and he does, a Hochdeutsch translation, really, of the Bible, hadn't been done before, and that would sort of go away, and there'd be a kind of natural communion of sensibilities. There would be a kind of, joint Jewish-German Bildung. It would be Cheder would meet Bildung, and they would live happily ever after, if only. Never really quite happens. I mean, I think the deepest shadow at the end of the book, and I was very anxious. I'm anxious throughout. Said this before, that this is a whole project about vitality, not about mortality. I wanted to write Jewish history, which wasn't simply an endless 2,000-page long overture to Auschwitz. I did not want to do that. My great predecessor at Columbia, called Selah Baron, used to complain about the lachrymose tradition in Jewish history. I mean, the Death Star is out there orbiting, and, it's going to be there. But I didn't want to make it really color everything black.
Well, one of the answers to that is the vitality of the voices that come in. And they're very various. They're from all ages. You referred to yourself as a ventriloquist the other day in an interview with Jonathan Friedland in The Guardian. And I wondered, what is it that makes you choose a particular voice? First of all, why that free indirect style in which you're very often speaking in sometimes rather reprehensible voices? You have to speak as an anti-Semite at times in that free indirect style.
Yeah, that's true.
How does it feel to write that?
What a wonderful question. And again, tediously, I will answer it properly. But I know when the magnitude of the difficulty occurred to me is when I was actually writing Landscape and Memory, and that's an amazing thing happened when R.B. Warburg, who became the great pioneer of iconography, a decoding of mysterious undertexts in Renaissance paintings, listened to lectures at Basel University given in the same year, I think it was 1873, in fact, I'm sure it's 1873, by Nietzsche and Burckhardt, and the notes in Nietzsche's case, which became the birth of tragedy. And I thought, okay, to sort of understand this moment, I indeed have to actually step into the kind of cultural, everything really, the cultural persona of the rationalist and the irrationalist, really, and how difficult that was. Really did have to walk with demons as well as professors in that way. And so the more I actually learn about that year, the more, it would make an incredible stage play, I think. They were such friends, Nietzsche and Burckhardt, to the point which Burckhardt promotes Nietzsche at a very young age to be professor of philology, and then they fall out hugely. But the same thing is true, is that once you, and it happens when you get into old geezerdom, I may have started old geezerdom very early, or as in Gore Vidal's lovely phrase, the springtime of senility, which I like, which I'm enjoying. When you do that, you are completely liberated from academic writing, unless you don't want to be, which is also fine. And one of the few things I agree, rather presumptuous for me to say this, but with Pierre Bourdieu about, graduate and undergraduate students, is that a lot of academic life is trapped by the necessities of professorial self-reproduction. That's to say, you learn the ropes of the conference, the seminar paper, the supervision essay, and so on. And this seems to be the norm in which serious history is really delivered. But we know serious history was a kind of performance art from Herodotus onwards. Herodotus was, actually, it's now thought, sang his history, actually, at Delphi, among other places as well. So it's had, and you referred to this earlier, an extraordinary richness of voice. And once you are kind of liberated from these sort of tribal obligations of the profession, you simply open yourself to this multiplicity of voices you find in the archive. Rather than flattening them out exegetically, you let them do their thing. Now, of course, it's an illusion that you can become them, but I don't know, I want to move some of the way towards actually thinking what it would like to have them in the room. And because it's Jewish history, I suspect, they're not shy of letting you know what it was like.
I was going to say, do you know that there's a wonderful remark that Philip Roth made. He was interviewed by Hilary Sperling, and he said, it's not what a book is about that makes a book Jewish. It's that the book won't shut up. In the best possible way. He meant it's clamorous. It wants to have the argument. And it wants to have the counter-argument as well, if possible.
You know the difference between a Jew and a non-Jew, Tom?
I don't.
Okay, well, a non-Jew goes without saying goodbye, and a Jew says goodbye and never goes. Actually, and goes on saying goodbye. So
how do you, when you're doing that business of finding the voice and trying to project it, what are you basing it on? Your work is, you refer very often to Jewish scholars and to serious works of Jewish historiography, but what were you mostly working with in terms of raw material too?
Oh, well, actually, the sources themselves, that's to say letters, diaries, autobiographies, memoirs, descriptions. In Herzl's case, around the time of the First Zionist Congress in 1897, there was no shortage of descriptions, some of it fantastical about him, looking like an Assyrian prince or verging on the absurd. But then there are good, friends like Schnitzler, for example, who talks about Herzl's obsession. He was terrible, with his clothes and his rehearsing his speeches in front of a mirror. So you get a kind of strong. So you do what all historians do. You don't merely take it on trust, because when they're writing their memoirs, whether they're meant to be published or not, and many of them were meant to be published, they are themselves casting themselves in a particular role. So you have to be aware of that. There is somewhere in this extraordinary kind of, ultimate bar mitzvah party of all these people living in dead, a vestige of the cool, dispassionate Simon somehow arbitrating between, fantastical self-presentation and reality. At least I hope there is, really.
I want to open it up so that people can ask questions, but just before I do...
I can I just say one more thing, because it's a Cambridge thing. Sorry, Tom. And it was when I talked about, the rights of collective self-reproduction. I was just dumb luck put me in Christ's in the early 60s, where my professor mentor was Jack Plum, and he was there was a kind of rhetorical civil war going on. I know there are a lot of you historians here, between those who really took a much more austere view that the historian's job was really to be simply an editorial interpreter of archival sources, and then Plum, who really had Trevelyan, G.M. Trevelyan, and therefore he had that connection all the way back to Macaulay, and before Macaulay really to 18th century, roman philosophique, and Plum's view was much more kind of forthrightly polemical, rhetorical, maybe theatrical, but he kind of rejoiced in the bouncy exuberance of language. He would actually spend, in a supervision, about half of it taking apart this or that paragraph, actually. So he made me feel that history, he said, actually, once famously, he said, remember, Simon, you belong to an ancient craft which began with Herodotus shouting in the marketplace, or something like that. So, I was lucky, really, to have that as a kind of initiation. It wasn't to say you can take archival sources and scholarship lightly, but that really the kind of public voice of history and the scholarly voice were mutually replenishing rather than the opposite.
You've sort of answered my next question, I think. You teach narrative nonfiction, and that's not quite an oxymoron, but it's something that people could work into an oxymoron if they were feeling sufficiently, stiff-collared about it. You don't think that. That's
no.
not. We're not talking literature and scripture as opposing forces brought together there.
No, I certainly don't think that. I remember actually one of the great books I read as I suppose I was 12 or something, was Garrett Mattingly's Defeat of the Spanish Armada. It's still an extraordinary book, and that was based absolutely, very strictly on the sources of the Spanish Royal State Archive in Simancas. But it began with an astonishingly beautifully fashioned piece of prose. It began in media res. That's what I loved about, beginning of War and Peace, et bien mal passe. I loved about the opening of the French Revolution, which begins with a polite discussion in a parliament about the nicknames of kings. It's absolutely wonderfully, and you're immediately, instead of actually having an introduction, sort of setting out your wares in this kind of voice in lead boots way, you're actually thrown through the window into the past. And Mattingly actually begins, no one knew when the messenger would arrive, and it's this rider with letter from Queen Elizabeth actually demanding that the trial go forward and that the trial of Mary Queen of Scots at Fotheringhay Castle. And actually, I give this to my students because Mattingly deliberately, in a short opening paragraph to this extraordinary masterpiece, really, repeats the word no one about 4 times, quite deliberately. So it has the kind of chime of a toll of bells to it without him needing to spell out. And when I actually do teach both students in narrative nonfiction, I want them to be conscious of the choices they have to make something beautiful and even poetic.
But
I think I said, I can't remember an article, historian, who doesn't aim for the poetic is just a purveyor of information. Bit strong, possibly.
But also aiming for the tense. I think what's wonderful about that sentence you've just quoted is it restores us to a condition in which somehow, magically, we don't know how the story ends.
Yeah.
Or we are cast
Yes.
back to that moment at which nobody
Yes,
knows what happens next.
Yes, I think that's right.
I do want to throw it open because we're limited for time, and I don't know whether anybody has questions. I've got more if you haven't, but if you want to ask, just down here. I don't know whether you need a microphone, or there's one on the table. Oh, right, it's all right, we've got microphones.
Thank you. Thanks very much. You mentioned remembering and forgetting identities, both in the contemporary political and cultural situation, also in many of your books as well. And I just wondered, do you think people have shorter cultural memories now than they did in some of the periods of history you've looked at? And is that part of the reason why things are the way they are politically?
Well, it's a wonderful question, and has unfortunately a kind of boringly complicated answer, because actually in some ways you're right, that, let's take it, because I live in New York, my case in point, it's extraordinary to me that it's still possible for the Republican Party to argue that if you cut taxes radically, you're automatically going to be blessed with a sudden miraculous burst of economic growth, despite the fact this wasn't the case under Reagan, it wasn't the case under GW, and so on. So that's the sort of sense, in a very crude way, of the kind of, the loss of medium-term cultural memory. But what we're seeing all over the world, and I remember the moment when I thought, we're heading into unexpectedly black water here, was when I heard Slobodan Milosevic, or rather someone translating Slobodan Milosevic's speeches. Yugoslavia had not quite formally broken up yet, but the sway of Titoist communism had. And he was banging the drum about Battle of Kosovo and Serbian disasters, and I thought, sometimes you can have too much memory, so that, the sort of selective memory of either victimization or self-congratulation is absolutely with us everywhere, really. And, what I think, insofar as it has stopped, Ulster and Catholic Ireland, Protestant Ireland, Catholic Ireland, kind of agreed to park the memories, really. I wish it were the case. Desperately wish it were the case with 1948 and Palestinians and Israelis. And there was a time, and it looked as though it might be the case, but, dream on. So there's this sort of sense of, and of course, actually, the kind of perpetuation of mutually hostile atavistic mythologies is sort of the opposite of history. History, for me, why I loved it in Cambridge and beyond, as a small child, really, was the experience of meeting someone not like you. Not like you. Lost from you in time, and in my case, because I only came to British history much, much later, essentially someone, in a radically... I resisted doing Jewish history precisely because I'd been brought up with it. Not this kind of history, to be sure, but a religious upbringing. And I wrote a book on Jewish history, my second book, about the Rothschild family, French Rothschilds, and period of Jewish settlement before political Zionism. And immediately my uncles and aunties stopped talking to me, as a result. That wasn't the reason. I thought, well, I'm not the sort of, not that you're wrong to deal with the history of your own immediate culture, but what actually thrills me is that reach towards the mysterious, actually. And actually, I think, again, I seem to have been getting very Greek on you, but that's the difference between Thucydides and Herodotus. Herodotus is an Ionian, though he's not an Athenian, and therefore one of the marvels of that book of his about the Persian Wars is his deliberate ethnographic stretch to try and understand not just Persian culture and religion, but Egyptian and Parthian and Syrian and so on. And he's a great, it's totally in some narrative way incoherent. He's a great kind of chatty gossiper, really. Thucydides is a fired general who's had to abandon his own part in the Peloponnesian Wars, and he's entirely and darkly and inwardly Athenian, which doesn't make him bad at all. But those are two very different tempers, and for me, history has always been about the discovery of something somewhere else, really. And actually, I think there is plenty of Jewish experience that is, I mean, there were chapters on China, and there's a chapter I enjoyed writing very much on Yemen in the late 19th century, where a kind of French professor of inscriptions goes into a place you didn't quite expect in Yemen with a most wonderful guide. And that was a very kind of happy, in a way, chapter, because it was, again, about him coming right away from Oriental scholarship in Paris into a kind of magical, strange, and terrifying world.
Yes, down on the front row here.
Hi, thanks. You subtitled your book Belonging. My question is, hypothetically, if you were writing a book about modern British history or modern world history, indeed, how would you chapter the last 10 years? Sorry to be so contemporary.
No, that's fine. That's fine. All history is contemporary history, as Benedetto Croce once said. But I'm not sure I understand the question about how would you title the history. Well, I'm not sure I have a cute one-word title for you, really. But it has been. What it's about. Look, I think a lot of these startling moments in both American and British history, which are my friends in the liberal press have striven to say is about actually people like us ignoring economic anger in the Rust Belt in the United States, for example, or in North Carolina, empirically turn out not to be the case. The average household income of people voting for Donald Trump was between $80,000 and $100,000 a year. It turns out to be about ferocious cultural alienation and a cultural civil war which is going on. I'm not saying the same thing is happening here over Brexit, but clearly a very long-term change in the nature of British society, which was really the kind of blowback from imperial power, namely the assumption that when the British Empire ended, you would be able to absorb immigrants. And because they all play cricket, they would in some sense be unproblematic Britons. And I think, I'm of the view that in deep and important ways they are unproblematic Britons. Sadiq Khan, Michel Hussein, or else you want to do a kind of list, really. These are Britons with a distinctive background. They belong both to their own personal and cultural memories, and they absolutely belong to Britain. But Brexit was so bloody strange. Something that I very seldom say, I agree with Tony Blair. In one observation he made, he said really, actually, when people say, I walk down the street and I don't recognize England, and it's usually England anymore, they don't mean a Romanian plumber. They mean the Pakistani newsagent. But this was the first chance they had to vote about their distress at not recognizing the England they saw. And I think that's as I said, it's the kind of extraordinary, it's the sort of joy of hatred, this extraordinary energy of estrangement, of making your neighbor into a stranger.
There's that very striking remark from Moses Mendelssohn at one point, the great Enlightenment Jewish thinker. Delusion and fanaticism act while all reason does is talk.
Yeah.
I got to that page and thought,
yes,
it's
back. Trouble. We are back to that. Yeah.
Yes, sorry, here.
Thank you. This is a bit of a follow-on from that question just there. This might be a bit abstract, but I'm not an expert.
I'm up for abstract.
A time when alterity, in whatever form it happens to be, is not identified and rejected, or is that just too inherently human and it's been repeated throughout history time and again?
Wow. Deep question. Well, I don't know how to answer you because, of course, I would love that to be the case. But, we all once thought that the web would bring us the blessings of effortless cultural interchange. And it turns out to be a nesting place of horror, of tribal echo chambers of mutual hatred. So that's why I say I don't quite know how to answer you. Fundamentally, I'm an optimist, really. So, in the end, I think, because there are places where alterity works. It wasn't just London that voted against Brexit, really, but also Liverpool and Manchester and Edinburgh and Glasgow. The places precisely which are...
Cities conspicuous.
Not all of them. Yorkshire went a bit, funny, but yes, the places where you would expect alterity to be most suspected and mistrusted and raise hackles were the place where... So in a sense, I'm trying to make the case, it wasn't just one rabbi and one cardinal, but Jews are on the streets of Amsterdam every day. Some of them are dressed in funny Polish Ashkenazi, like they are in Stamford Hill. And this is the time to tell a joke. We have a session on radio. So a chassid from Stamford Hill walks into a bar with a parrot on his shoulder, and the publican says, "Where'd you get that?" And the parrot says, "Stamford Hill, there are thousands of them." On the streets of Amsterdam, and then there are Jews who dress indistinguishably from the Dutch. And the Dutch actually make it, the states of Holland, and then eventually the states of the other provinces, make it illegal to require badges of identification on your dress. That is a first, actually, in all, including Islamic countries, in the entirety of Jewish experience. And so, in that sense, Christians don't pretend that Jews are all massively destined to convert at some particular day. They might hope that. They are just rubbing shoulders. That's why the dockers then go on strike and are shot in large numbers in Amsterdam in 1942 when the deportations became. Neighborliness can actually happen. Let's hope so.
Yeah, one more, I think, here.
Hello. I just wanted to ask a question in relation to a story I once heard. I believe Sigmund Freud, in his later years, was visiting Rome, and he sent a postcard back to his doctor, Dr. Abraham Yehuda. I think it was musing on the fall of Jerusalem to the Romans.
Yeah.
And he talked about many being led into slavery, and at the end he concluded the Jew survives it.
Yes, that's right. No, it was a postcard. It features in your homework tonight is the rush onto YouTube, you could actually, and see Program 1 and the story of the Jews. Because we end with that, exactly that. It was the arc of that program, which wasn't repeated in Volume 1 of the book, was Freud completed Moses and Monotheism, a very odd but absolutely radically compelling book, as I'm sure you know, when he's in London and had massive cancer of the jaw. And then the end, he's looking at the Arch of Titus, and the postcard is of the Arch of Titus, which is a Roman triumph of the Romans carrying off everything, rather remarkably, except the Sefer Torah, except the Scrolls of the Law, which is weirdly missing, but the huge menorah from the temple. So it's kind of swag from Herod's temple, and he does say the Jews survive it. So more than that, were you implying that he felt that however darkness closed in with the Third Reich, the Jews would still survive it? Because I think probably that was slightly on it. He was no Zionist, but he was no anti-Zionist either. Is that what you meant?
I was going to just follow up slightly.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Don't interrupt you. I'm sorry. As is my wont, yeah.
I was wondering, it's maybe a nebulous point, but would you say, if you maybe could succinctly, whether you thought there was anything that was Jewish that didn't survive? If there's something that's been lost, or if you don't want to answer that and it's a bit...
No. It's an extremely good question. I can... what have been lost have been millions of lives, not just in the Holocaust, but the pogroms were... Do you know nearly... between 100 and 200,000 Jews lost their lives in the First World War between the great mutual steamrollers of the German Austro-Habsburg armies. This is all overwhelmingly in southern Ukraine, in Galicia, and the Russian army on the other side. absolutely extraordinary number of people. So lives have been lost. What the Nazis wanted to do, famously, was not just to turn Jewish bodies into soot blown away by the wind. They wanted to completely annihilate Jewish culture and Jewish tradition, and went elaborately about creating museums of, stuff that they got from Russian and Czech and so on synagogues. But that, of course, has absolutely not happened. And the Jews learnt very early, to make their tradition not dependent on buildings and monuments and inscriptions, but to carry in the shape of the scrolls and papyri portable memory and portable religion and portable strictures. And if you think about that, one of the most, many things are slipping away from Jewish tradition, including young Jews, but one of the most extraordinary things that have happened in America in particular, and in Russia, actually, interestingly, where it just was last week, is the revival of Yiddish literature and Yiddish drama. And that was taken to be absolutely gone, really, with the Jews of Central Europe, except as a kind of ornamental and sentimental reminiscence. And that's not happened. So, we're the only religion, I think, that in the Passover Seder, in particular, actually also in the book of Exodus, is required zachor. You're required to remember, really. So it's being Jewish is a kind of playground for the historian, really, I suppose.
I was just going to say, it's not just scrolls and papyri, it's books too, and
Yeah.
books like this. I'm afraid we do have to stop now because there's another debate coming here. I'm sure there's a lot more questions, but we have to stop. I'd just ask you to thank Simon Schama for an absolutely riveting talk.
Thank you, Charles. Thank you. Thank you.
I will just say as well, there's a wailing wall of copies out there, but the books are actually going to be signed in the dining room. So if you want a copy of the book signed, that's where to get it done.
I'm going to leave you with one thing, the ultimate Jewish joke, and it's the shortest. A waiter comes over to two old ladies who've eaten forever in the same kosher restaurant, and he says very carefully and tentatively, "Is anything all right?"
Very good.